Joel Berkowitz is a professor of English and director of the Sam and Helen Stahl Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's a theater historian, translator, and dramaturg focusing on Yiddish and other Jewish theater and drama, and currently writing a book about Yiddish drama after the Holocaust. He is co-founder of the digital Yiddish theater project, yiddishstage.org, an international research group that publishes articles and other resources on Yiddish theater for both specialists and the general public. And we're honored to have him present his paper today entitled Sacred and Secular Spaces in Yiddish Drama After the Shoah. Please join me in welcoming Joel Berkowitz.
Thank you, Daniela. I am honored to be here. I'm really honored to be a keynote with Ruthie, and I'm very grateful to Mark and Daniela and Holly, and I know there's lots of other people involved in making something like this run so smoothly and be so rich and interesting, and particularly at such a challenging time. If we think about many of the most notable plays and productions of the modern era, much of what comes to mind will be iconic places. These include, to name just a few examples, the door of the Helmer household that Nora closes so consequentially when she makes her final exit from a doll's house, Chekhov's cherry orchard, the mostly barren landscape of Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and the backyard of the Maxon home in Pittsburgh's Hill District in August Wilson's Fences. This is just as true of the great Broadway musicals. For example, there we go with Oklahoma, Deborah, the cornfields of Oklahoma, the gritty New York streets of West Side Story, and of course, the rooftops and other venues we find in our dear little village of Anatevka. And it's at least as true of the Yiddish stage. In Shulamis, the heroine and Avishola make a sacred oath in the desert, invoking a weasel and a well as witnesses. Shulamis later makes her own chambers a kind of sacred space with the aria Shabbos Yontiv und Rosh Chodesh. In Gott von der Koma, which came up in passing before, the sanctity of the Torah scroll commissioned for Rivka's bedroom and the brothel downstairs sit in uneasy and ultimately disastrous proximity to one another. And in Del Dibik and Bei Nacht auf den Alten Mark, a mixture of sacred and secular, and the added later of Oilem Hazeh, this world interacting with Oilem Abeh, the world to come, which influences one of the plays I'll be discussing in a moment. I'm coming to the theme of this conference from a bit of a tangent. Though opera constitutes an important part of the Yiddish theatrical repertoire, obviously, opera singers and cantors figured prominently among the stars of the Yiddish stage, as we keep learning more about, and the cast of characters of Yiddish plays are populated with any number of singers, bards, chazans, and related figures like badchens. All of that is less true in the body of plays I'm spending most of my time with at the moment, the largely overlooked repertoire of plays written mostly after World War II that grapple with the Holocaust and its aftermath, mostly after, meaning that some of that is happening even before the war starts, responses to Nazism and fascism, and of course through the war. But these plays are filled with sites of Jewish ritual and tradition, juxtaposed with everyday locales such as homes and city streets. And sometimes these locales are given a certain sacred or ritual nature by virtue of the circumstances the characters find themselves in. Today, I'd like to sample selected examples of this body of work through the prism of these spaces to give a broad overview of this repertoire and some of its key writers and themes and reflect a bit on its significance. So a few words about the larger project. This is a book project that examines a significant body of Yiddish dramas, most published and or first produced between, I'm starting the story probably with the liberation of Paris in 1944 with Chaim Slovis, who we'll hear a little bit more about, and going on probably to about the mid to maybe late 60s when the lion's share of these plays are created. And they continue to be created even today, but it sort of trails off after that. And also some of my major figures like Leivik and Slovis are sort of coming to the end of their lives or near the end of their lives around that point. Many of these plays grapple directly with the Shoah and its aftermath, so they're set in concentration camps or ghettos or other sites of resistance and killing or hiding. Others depict episodes, biblical stories and episodes from Jewish history, often as commentary on the Shoah. They're created by an international array of writers who included prominent Yiddish playwrights, Yiddish writers better known for work in other genres, and even some amateur writers or people who hadn't been writers before the war. The plays were published literally all over the map, from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the States, Canada, South America, South Africa, Australia. Some of the plays were produced widely, and some have been translated into other languages, and only a fairly small minority have been staged. So these are the plays, and color-coded them for different spaces, which we'll get into later. Actually, I'm not going to talk, I meant to take that out of the slide. I'm not going to talk about Blois Ash, the first one by Yisrael Aschendorf, just for the sake of time. I can talk about it in the Q&A if people want to ask about it. But his two one-act plays, Der selbe Geurel and Noch ein Mabel, the great poet Kadia Molodowski's play, Noch ein Gott von Midbar, the great poet and playwright Levik's Maharam von Rothenberg and the Chassene von Fernwald, and Chaim Slovis's Die Joines und der Walfisch. I'll hold off on that for a second. So 6 plays by 4 playwrights. All 4 of these people are noteworthy commentators on the Holocaust, some better known than others. Levik was well established as a major poet and playwright by the early 1920s. Molodowski was recognized as a significant talent from her early years writing poetry, though she wrote only a handful of plays. Slovis was a lawyer by training, but also had a theatrical background, but he emerged after the liberation of Paris as a noteworthy playwright, and really that becomes his full-time profession, writing Yiddish, sometimes also translating his own work into French, and sometimes writing sort of lighter things for French radio and things like that. Aschendorf is probably the least familiar figure here, but he was a highly regarded playwright, poet, and fiction writer in his day, and was closely connected to better-known figures like Shmerke Kaczyginski and Chaim Grade. The plays I've chosen by these writers take us to several types of physical settings: naturalistic, domestic environments, sites in the Jewish past of significance to the present, and 2 familiar biblical locations that the playwrights turn on their heads to comment on the post-war moment. There are countless prisms through which to examine this significant and largely overlooked body of work. Let's see what we can gain through the lens of space. Before we start looking at individual plays, I want to talk a bit about the act of looking and not looking. Looking and seeing are typically central to the experience of theater. We talk about seeing a play, after all, and that's often true of doing the work of theater history. Among the many kinds of evidence theater historians examine are visual ones, production photos, studio portraits of actors in costumes, scene and costume designs, and so on. Fortunately, we can do that for some post-Shoah Yiddish plays. Unfortunately, more often than not, these plays were not staged, or I'd prefer to say that they haven't been staged yet. There are various reasons for that, and it's not always possible to pinpoint the reason for any particular play. Broadly speaking, though, Yiddish playwrights after the war had far fewer outlets than they had had earlier for staging their work. And of course, there are some very obvious reasons for that, and we can talk more about that later, the Holocaust being the main one, but other things going on in repression in the Soviet Union, language battles between Hebrew and Yiddish in Israel, assimilation, acculturation in other parts of the world. And so, these playwrights were writing for what might be thought of, at least at times, as a kind of ghost theater, or maybe an imagined future theatrical culture that first needed to be rebuilt almost from the ground up after the war. When we talk about space in such plays, we are relying often on what the texts tell us and how we might imagine them being staged, rather than finding visual or textual evidence of how they were actually staged. That's true, for starters, in the case of the first play I've chosen to represent the domestic sphere in this talk. A few words about Yisrael Aschendorf, born in present-day Ukraine in 1909, raised in Lemberg, now Lviv. He was involved in Yiddish theater in Lemberg in the 1930s, including with his adaptation of Goldfaden's Bar Kochba and his original play, Die Brodersinger. He was the secretary of YIVO and of the Yiddish Theater Society in Lemberg in the late 30s. During the war, he made his way into the USSR, spent much of it in Tashkent, made his way back to Poland afterwards, moved to Paris in 1948, and on to Buenos Aires in 1953. He wrote several one-act plays and completed 2 full-length biblical dramas after the war, and sadly his life was cut very short. He died suddenly in 1956 at the age of 47. And so this first play, Der selbe Geurel, the same fate, was, as far as I know, never staged. It was first published in Yiddish Schriften in Lodz in 1948, and it was republished in a posthumous book of Aschendorf's writings. The scene is the home of a Jewish mother, and by the way, that other play that I said I'm not going to discuss for reasons of time, Blois Asch, was first published in the same volume, interestingly. We're in the home of a Jewish mother who has a young child. As the action begins, her father comes to the door. They were estranged after she married a non-Jewish communist. He's come to warn her that the area is about to be liquidated and to ask her to flee with him and with her mother. Despite the rift that had happened between them, the daughter is ready to go. Just then, a knock on the door complicates things and complicates the meaning of the physical spaces of the play. When the Christian next-door neighbor shows up, sheepishly asking for first dibs to take over the mother's apartment in the morning, since he's gotten advance word of the roundup too. This leads the mother to offer it on one condition, that he and his wife take in her son and raise him as their own. Well, the neighbor returns home, so he goes back next door to discuss this with his wife, and the grandfather, hearing all of this, and he's hidden because his presence would only complicate things with the neighbor, and they also didn't know who was going to show up at the door before he came. Grandfather comes back into the room and urges his daughter to bring the boy with them, no matter what comes next. These translations are all mine. I'll read the Yiddish. Tochter, wir gehen in der Früh zum Teut. Der Mann deiner ist arrestiert geworden wie ein Kommunist. Wir sollen auch, die Deutschen, sind in einer reinen Stadt. Und kein Schun Simmen von Leben ist von ihm nicht da. Das Kind wird bleiben bei sich. Und was ist ein Kind? Ein Kind heißt Hemmschicht von dir, von mir, von unser Volk, von sein Steiger und sein Sprach. Von dem alles wird das Kind abgerissen und abgeschmatt werden. Es wird gestellt werden an gegen dem, vor welchen wir gehen sterben, und euch an gegen dem, vor welchen dein Mann hat so viel gelitten. Because the mother is persuaded by this reasoning, her home becomes the site of a kind of family reunion and reconsecration, since the family is now a fully Jewish family again. It's clear that they've moved a fair distance away from tradition. The grandfather's and mother's relationship reminds me in some ways of Tevye's and Chava's, but under the circumstances, this alternate outcome does not represent a happy ending necessarily. The grandfather has already spoken about likely going to our deaths, and he hardly sugarcoats this prediction for his grandson. The first Jewish thing he teaches the child is the story of the binding of Isaac, not the lightest of children's stories, but a central motif in post-war Yiddish writing. It'll be important for Leivik too, for example. The child is quite taken with the story, particularly with Isaac's bravery, and says he's not afraid because the angel will come and stop the hand holding the knife. But the grandfather can't help but disabuse him, replying, Kind meins, nicht tomed kommt der Malach. My child, the angel doesn't always come. Ultimately, this family heads off to an uncertain fate, and the rest of the spaces described in the play are imagined ones, of gathering in the local Jewish cemetery at the command of the Nazis, of going as the mother replies to her son when he asks, far, far away from here, and of the arrested father's possible return home, because we don't know yet ever what happened to him. If that happens, the mother suggests, upon not finding them there, he will reckon with those responsible and take nekome, revenge, the last words of the play. Interesting twist also, what we learn only kind of after the mother has decided that she's not going to leave the son with the neighbors and she's going to take him with them, that the son has actually been sort of harassed pretty badly by the neighbor's own child, the family that he would have gone into. And that wasn't part of the discussion. We didn't know whether the neighbors have children at all, and that sort of comes out later, so making the sort of dilemmas even more fraught and complicated. So I'm going to turn to Leivik, and let me say a few words about him and look at a very different way of dealing with a domestic space. Leivik was born in a shtetl in Belarus in 1888, one of 9 children. He became involved in radical politics with the Bund starting in 1905, was arrested several times, sent to 4 years penal servitude and then exile in Siberia in 1908. And he starts writing poetry there and really making a name for himself, so much so that in 1913, supporters send him money from America. He makes a very long journey and makes his way to New York, where he settles. He goes on to become a prolific and greatly admired lyric poet as well as a playwright. And a few things to say about his long and really significant career. Like his literary hero, Yudlamid Peretz, he moves back and forth in his dramaturgy between raw naturalism at one end of the spectrum and symbolism and other non-naturalistic modes at the other. In both his plays and his poetry, Leivik was engaged with the rise of fascism and anti-Semitism long before World War II started, and wrote extensively about those topics from the mid-1930s to the end of his career. He died in New York in 1962. That's just an example of, this is a very naturalistic play, and really extraordinary that Leivik writes about the Warsaw Uprising. The play actually debuts in 1944, right? The uprising was in 1943. So he's basically like the second it's happening. He's clearly researching it, and it's a very detailed sort of naturalistic account of, he fictionalizes things, but based on extensive research. Fast forward just a little bit, a couple of years later, Leivik joined a delegation sponsored by the United Nations Refugee Relief Administration and the World Jewish Congress in 1946. He went to Germany to visit Jewish TP camps and towns with singer Emma Shaver, who gave concerts at the camps they visited, and rabbi and writer Yisrael Efres, who, like Leivik, gave poetry readings and lectures. And this was in sort of May, June of 1946. The trip was cut short because of issues of permissions, so Leivik and Efres went home, but Emma Shaver actually just stuck around and kept touring camps herself for some time longer. All 3 wrote memoirs of these experiences. Leivik's was Mit der Schere Saplete, Tagebuchverzeichnungen von meiner Reise über die jüdische Lagerin von der Amerikanerzone in Deutschland. And these are from Shaver's and Efres's books about the same experiences. An encounter with DPs in one of the camps affected Leivik so deeply that it inspired his 1949 drama Die Chassene in Fernwald, the Wedding in Fernwald. That work is sprawling and complex, but I'll discuss just one scene to illustrate Leivik's twist on domestic spaces in post-war Yiddish drama. The important theater critic Nochem Buchwald called the play Die Drame von der Schere Saplete und von dem größten jüdischen Choben. Dort handelt es sich nicht bloß wegen die Leben gebliebene Jiden, nur euch wegen die Umgekommene. Die Teute vernehmen sich nicht weniger Platz wie die Lebendige, öfter noch mehr. Eigentlich ist der heutige Konflikt Tage gebeut auf einen dramatischen Wikuch zwischen die Umgebrachte und die Geratewette. The first scene of the play introduces mystical, historical, and messianic elements. And then the second brings us to the heart of the story. It's the household of a family consisting of the unabashedly symbol-laden figures Avram, his wife Sora, and their 4-year-old son Yitzchok. So Levick immediately signals that while he brings us into the domestic sphere, this is not just any Jewish home, just as Dachau, where they live, the town of Dachau, that is not just any German town. And of course, it's not just any moment in history. This is early in the war. The Jews have started to be rounded up, but this family hasn't just yet. It's Pesach, and as Avram prepares for the Seder, he tells Sarah that they have a particular duty to observe Pesach at the moment because they are among a handful of Jews left in the area who have not been rounded up. But Sarah's focus is elsewhere because Yitzchak was badly beaten earlier in the day by anti-Semites, and he just barely managed to escape. Remember, this is a very small boy. His parents argue in ways that we'll see echoed in another play, by a different playwright, in a moment. Sarah asks, Wie lang noch meinst du, wollen sie uns zurulosen, Avram? How long do you think they'll let us be? He replies, So lang wie Gott Baruch Hu wird wollen. Yitzchokol ist Tage zerwundigt, aber es doch Gott zu danken mit uns. As long as God allows. Yes, it's true that Yitzchok was wounded, but thank God he's still with us. So that tension between Sarah focusing on their own preservation and survival and potentially escape, and Avram really sort of leaving things to God. When we first see the child a moment later, his head and feet are bandaged, and he's holding 3 friends, his stuffed cat, dog, and goat. Soon they'll play an even more important role than comforting him. A few moments after Yitzchok's entrance, the clock announces, Die Deutschen kommen. Its repeated warning, "Sie kommen, sie kommen, sie kommen," is punctuated by all 3 animals swearing that they'll never abandon Yitzchok. Ominously, when the boy asks his parents to swear the same thing, Avram resists several times until finally capitulating. Ultimately, when the Germans do arrive, the father will be separated from his wife and son. The Germans won't let him go with them, although he does ask to. Sarah and Yitzchok will perish in the gas chambers, but return to literally haunt Avram, who survives the camps and spends the rest of the play trying, along with other DPs, to rebuild his life. And he actually meets another Sarah. So now we have Sarah 1 and Sarah 2, and Avram and the second Sarah, you might say fall in love, or you might just say kind of fall into company with each other and think, well, fate has thrown us together and she's lost a husband as well. And the tension between the other Sarah coming back and saying, basically, what the hell are you doing? And, you were supposed to be with me, propels much of the rest of the play. Levick has a couple more theatrical flourishes up his sleeve in this scene after Sarah and Yitzchok are taken away. Neighbors enter speaking German. Like grotesque figures out of an Otto Dix painting, they devour the food at the Seder table, mixed with their own treif that they've brought with them. And they drink so much that they fall into a deep sleep. The clock slips down off the wall, and the animals, like in Chad Gadya, turn on each other, with the goat staying loyal to Yitzchak and the others denying any knowledge of him and acting on their predatory instincts. Stylistically, this is, of course, a strikingly different way of confronting human behavior in extremis from Aschendorf's naturalistic approach. But interestingly, we'll soon see echoes of the devices Levick uses here in another Aschendorf play. Now I'm going to pivot a bit to looking at a couple of plays that bring us sights of Jewish history as a way of helping to understand the Shoah. So you might think, well, now we're talking about different points in time, and that's more about space or more about time than about space, but I would say that they're related in ways that we'll see in a moment. So we'll turn to another play, Maharam von Rothenburg. It's often translated as the Sage of Rothenburg. Maharam, though, of course, is one of countless acronyms for a noted sage. In this case, we'll hear a little bit more about him. Maharam von Rothenburg combines moments of naturalism wedded to non-realistic devices like allegory and actually time travel. The play shuttles back and forth between, once again, Dachau is important to Levick, the Dachau concentration camp in 1943, and the German city of Mainz in the year 1286. Leivik did not pick the latter at random any more than he did the former. German Jewry in the late 13th century endured considerable persecution. At the same time, German sages produced a considerable body of scholarship. Mainz is a mere 250 miles from Dachau, and Leivik intentionally contrasts the distance of centuries with the spatial proximity of the two locations to make connections between the persecution of Jews so many centuries apart from one another. Rabbi Meir ben Boruch, often referred to as Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, although he lived in many places, or the Maharam, was a leading sage of his era who produced a significant body of Tosafot, responsa, commentaries, and liturgical poetry. He was also a leader of the German Jewish community. And in 1286, the year when most of the play takes place, he was arrested by the Bishop of Basel, imprisoned, held for ransom for an exorbitant amount, and in fact never released. He died in his fortress prison in Alsace in 1293. The play opens not in Mainz, but in Dachau, where we meet a 20-year-old inmate named Daniel. Ahasver, the wandering Jew, we see the costume design for him here, then appears and takes Daniel's spirit back in time. When they arrive there, Daniel asks, "How far are we from Dachau?" Ahasver answers, "Some 700 years in the past, no more." And Daniel says, "Really? No more? That's it?" And Ahasver later adds, "A Jew who's in Dachau is also in Mainz. A Jew who's in Mainz is also in Dachau at one and the same time, there and here." And this feels to me very much like a sort of post-Shoah kind of inversion of the idea that we were all standing at Sinai to receive the Torah. You know, that after the Holocaust, we were all in the camps, we were all at all of these sites of persecution. One striking choice Leivik makes with Daniel once he does bring him back in time is to leave him in his concentration camp uniform. And initially, other characters don't really notice it. And this is a historical figure. There's a figure in the play who's sort of the villain or one of the villains who is a Jew who got himself baptized and becomes a vicious anti-Semite. And he's the one who picks up on the fact that, wait a minute, you're a bit out of place here. What's going on with you? And also realizes that he's Jewish. The uniform is, of course, wildly out of place, except in one respect, which is explicitly referred to in the text. The yellow star, modernity's counterpart to the medieval Judenhut, the church, degrading, ridiculous-looking yellow hat that Jews were made to wear at certain times and places. It's one of countless parallels between the two eras, starting with a specific moment in 1286 when Daniel and Ahasver arrive right into the middle of a pogrom, and they're actually picking up glass off the street and sort of walking around with it and sort of reflecting on its significance. And right up to the final lines when the Maharam dies in his prison, as he did in history, and Ahasver and Daniel call on him to cum mit uns. Where exactly that's going to be, not entirely clear. And the way I think of it is actually one of my closest friends in graduate school wrote a dissertation on time travel plays. So we had a lot of conversations about it, and a lot of his research was about so what's the mechanism here and how is this working? And so the time travel geeks like him, and I say that very lovingly, would maybe sort of explore all of that. Leivik is I think fairly loose about it, and he has sort of other things to focus on. Where Leivik connects two moments in time to lead us to reflect on direct parallels between past and present. I'm sorry, I have another, before I get to Molodowski, there's a design for the Maharam's costume, and there's actually a picture from the Volksbühne production in 1963. Molodowski's Noch ein Gott von Midbar, After the Desert God, revolves around another major historical figure, this time from the 16th century. But there's no frame around her historical drama. Any connection between the life and times of Doña Gracia Mendez Nasi and the present are for us to make. But the connections are certainly there. A few words about Molodowski. Born in a shtetl in the Grodno province in 1894, born into a traditional family, but they also embraced the Haskalah, and she learned Yiddish, Jewish history, and modern Hebrew at home in addition to traditional religious subjects. She studied and worked in Warsaw, Odessa, and Kiev in the teens, and first published in the journal Eigens in 1920. She spent most of the next 15 years in Warsaw teaching Yiddish during the day and Hebrew at night while publishing extensively. She moved to New York in 1935 and lived there for most of the rest of her life, except for a couple of years in Tel Aviv in the early 1950s. She went on to publish several more major volumes of poetry, 2 plays, 2 novels, an autobiography, edited the literary journal Sviva, also edited a really fascinating anthology of post-Shoah Yiddish poetry, and she died in Philadelphia in 1975. I don't know of any productions. I've translated the play, and not one of these days, Mir Hashem, maybe I'll publish it. And so this is from a stage reading that was done in Milwaukee some years back. So that's the one program that as far as I know, that actually exists. So this is the first of the plays under discussion here, set entirely in the distant past, and so it's not explicitly about the Holocaust. But my working hypothesis that I'm looking for plays and determining what's relevant is that after the Shoah, if a playwright writes a Yiddish play set in sort of a biblical story or sometime in the past, I think it's likely going to be in some ways a commentary on the Holocaust. It just feels like they almost have to bend over backwards not to. And I think sometimes those connections are maybe more overt than others, and we'll see with Chaim Slovis that sometimes he will make those connections for us in very explicit ways. The canvas that Molodowsky paints on here is very broad, which is true of her heroine's history, and she follows her around to different places in Europe as she's trying to stay one step ahead of the Inquisition. As in Die Chasen in Fernwald, the Passover Seder is the setting for a key moment. In fact, Molodowsky's play opens with a Seder, but it's a Seder that like Leivik's is practiced, is observed under very difficult circumstances, but Doña Gracia's is done completely in hiding. It's clearly not legal to observe Pesach or any other Jewish traditions at that point, and so they're doing this secretly and with a great deal of anxiety about being caught. And moreover, the first line of Molodowsky's play isn't in Yiddish, it's Hebrew, a direct quote from the Haggadah, in fact, from the same passage that Leivik ends his Seder scene with, Shvoch alehem za'amecha v'charon apcha yasigem, pour out your great anger upon them and let your blazing fury overtake them. Molodowsky, like Leivik, paints on a large canvas. As I said, in Leivik's case, it's cosmically large, with a complex, kind of dizzyingly complicated interaction, actually, among human and supernatural characters, including Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, supernatural characters, including Elijah and God himself, and often characters like we think a character is sort of an ordinary person, and it turns out that they're the Messiah or God or whatever it might be. Molodowsky's breadth is more in geographic terms, with Gracia and her entourage going to different points in Europe. And as in Leivik, 2 central characters argue extensively about survival strategies, allegiance to God in Judaism, and the implications of their actions. In Molodowsky's case, it's Doña Gracia and her real-life sister, Brianda, whose running argument we first hear within a moment after the action begins. Brianda says, Ich hab dich gebeten, Gracia, wir sollen nicht oprichten kein Seder. Wir sollen nicht einstellen das Leben zu die irische Minogim. Es ist a Gefahr, a Lebensgefahr. We shouldn't, I've told you so many times, Gracia, we shouldn't hold a Seder, we shouldn't practice Jewish customs. It's dangerous. It's a danger to our lives. Gracia replies, die größte Gefahr ist, Brianda, als man erweitert sich von unser Vater in Himmel. And that's really kind of her mantra through the play, that the greatest danger is to distance ourselves from our Father in heaven. She is confident throughout that God will protect them, although she's also a master strategist. And there's a fascinating scene with a noblewoman when she's sort of trying to read between the lines. And so she's doing all kinds of things to, she's not just sort of like throwing up her hands and letting God take care of them. She's very good at taking care of herself, but that's the tension. The two sisters will continue fighting throughout the play. Molodowski introduces, to me, a very touching kind of romantic plot where this, as far as I know, completely invented figure, this French nobleman who falls in love with her and is truly a mensch, and she's clearly taken with him, and he will literally do anything for her, including like, hey, I know you need to go into hiding. I have this castle in the French countryside that you can use for a while, no strings attached, etc. And actually the title of the play, Noch ein Gott von Mirba, comes from him very late in the play, where as she and her entourage are planning to go from Ferrara in Italy, where she's just commissioned the writing of the Ferrara Chumash, which is also a real-life detail, and they're going to make their way to Constantinople to really leave Christian Europe and go to what she hopes are a more safe haven. He tries one more time to court her, and she just says, I can't. Basically, like this difference between us is too great. And he says something like, I've sort of, it was worth chasing you, after the desert god, even though I can't be with you in the end. I'm going to turn to Chaim Slovis, a really fascinating figure, born in Bialystok in 1905, interested in theater from an early age, involved in leftist politics as a young man, and becomes, for a lifelong communist, and writes about that. He spent time in Polish prisons and endured hunger strikes. Emigrated to Paris in 1916, earned a law degree from the Sorbonne, and that really is his day job until the war. And he starts writing plays before then, but really turns pretty much full time to writing plays after the war. And I mentioned Nochem Buchwald before, the important playwright in New York, also with strong leftist politics. The two of them struck up a correspondence before the war that continues quite touchingly after. There's a letter from Buchwald saying, Fine Slovis, it was so great to get your letter because we didn't know what happened to you, and I'm so relieved that you're alive. And Buchwald gives Slovis some really interesting sort of dramaturgical notes when Slovis sends him drafts of plays. During the war, Slovis served in the resistance in Vichy, returned to Paris after the liberation of France. He completed this play, Haman's Mapola, the downfall of Haman, of which I showed a poster earlier. He wrote that in both Yiddish and French, and it was sort of performed in both languages on alternating nights. He wrote for a variety of Yiddish publications and continued writing plays, some of which were performed quite widely in Yiddish, and sometimes some of them were performed in other languages. And he would ultimately die in Paris. I'd love to talk more about late Slovis's plays, and again, for the sake of time, won't get into them very much. But sometimes, Slovis is one of those figures that sometimes his introductions to his plays are almost as interesting as the plays themselves. He's a very interesting, thoughtful kind of critic of his own work and other people's work. And he has a fascinating introduction. Oh, here's that again. He has a fascinating introduction to his play Die Jonas und der Walfisch, The Jonahs and the Whale, where he takes the Jonah story and he creates a whole bunch of Jonahs. So there are I think 7 of them, and some of them are male and some of them are female, and they all have sort of variations on the name Jonah. There's Joine and Joinove and Joineche and etc. And so they're all kind of alter egos of one another, representing different facets of this, of course, fascinating, complicated figure and text, which immediately lends itself to some of the big questions of reflecting on the Shoah of what does it mean to try to flee, what's one's responsibility sort of morally to oneself and other people in a time of crisis and things like that. And here's what Slovis has to say, just part of a very interesting introduction about, he talks in the introduction about just the inherent theatricality of the Jonah story, of the very rich themes in the story that are very much what he wants to talk about, of this kind of everyman that we can all see ourselves in him, and perhaps part of why he wants to have sort of male and female Jonahs is that really, like, we can all see ourselves in him. And he says this, Und er so wie ich halt schon in an Plecken verreich, teurer Freund. Oib mir hat man gefragt, mein Volksspiel darf sein, Tage a moderne Pjesse, was es äußern zu erzählen wegen Heint und Fahrenheit. To verwas, gehen zum Heint darf durch den weiten Nächten. Wollt nicht gleicher gewesen, zu gucken auf den Arum, nicht durch einen allegorischen Schleier, nicht durch Ramosem und Unserhernischen, nur poschet direkt und unmittelbar? Ob die Joines meine seinen heindseitige Jiden, was jeder von uns begegnet sei alle Tage von der Woche, tot zu was verstellen sei in verzeitige tanachische Begotten. Why should I have gone back to the past to talk about the present? And interestingly, Slovis does both of those things. He writes plays that are very much set in the present. One of his plays that was performed quite widely, and that Annette Aronowitz, who is really the foremost scholar of Slovis, who's written a number of really important articles about him and his plays, has written a very detailed article about his play Nekomenemel, Avengers, and that's a very contemporary story of a partisan unit in Paris planning to murder, to assassinate a Gestapo officer. And the first act is the plot, the second is the sort of trying to carry out the assassination, which ultimately fails, and in the third act we find them in prison the night before they're going to be executed. So he does both of those things, but he also will go to different points, as he did in Holman's Mapole, very much in that kind of riotous spirit of Purim that Deborah was talking about, in obviously a very different context. But Holman's Mapole is quite funny and witty, and shows Slovis's tremendous sort of just dexterity as a writer, but also very sharply political. And again, I would refer people to Annette Aronowitz's work, which has dissected that really interestingly. I'm going to turn to where we're going to stay at sea and talk about another Aschendorf play called Nochen Mabel, After the Flood. And we're going to go back to the world of things being only printed and at least not yet staged. For just this kind of side note, Nochen Mabel the same word starts out Nochen Gott von Midbar, after the desert god, or literally after the god of the desert. Nochen Mabel is after the flood. Nochen Gott von Midbar is sort of following spatially, sort of this baron who is courting Doña Gracia, sort of following after her, and she is following after her god. The Nochen Mabel of Aschendorf's title is a temporal one, after the flood, and it doesn't take a huge leap to think, and we don't need Slovis to tell us that if you're writing an after the flood play immediately after the Shoah, that the flood is probably the Shoah, and that's going to become quite clear, if not from the very beginning of the play, then certainly once we get a bit further. The play opens with it's late in the period after the flood, as in the flood of Genesis, and the first section of the play consists of a set of conversations between animals, prey and predator, that comprise a dramatic midrash on Isaiah's prophecy: "V'gal ze'ev im keves v'namer im gedi yirbatz." The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid. Aschendorf starts with a wolf renouncing violence against a lamb, then a hawk doing the same with a dove, and they actually then confess that they've actually been romantically interested in one another, and so they're going to run off together. Then a spider making peace with a fly, and to bring us back to the creation, a snake and a woman burying the hatchet and also doing kind of like basically sexting each other, but in person. That's, I guess, a bit of an anachronism. But the language gets a little bit spicy, and they confess that they have the hots for one another. So, a very sort of humorous beginning seems to be a promising start for a new post-flood world, but ironically, the tone grows much darker with Noah's entrance. He is a benign presence, but as he declares the end of the flood and prepares to send everyone off to their new lives on land, they rebel. Anachronistically, like the Israelites longing for the flesh pots of Egypt, many of the human and animal passengers on the ark prefer to have Noah take care of them and have little desire to earn their own keep. And all kinds of resentments bubble up. Noah accuses one of his daughters-in-law of looting her neighbor's property and bringing much of it on board. He, in turn, is accused of having kept the best food for himself and given the rest to everyone else. He complains that there were other people he wanted to save, but people on the ark didn't let him. And only moments after seeming to make peace, predators start turning on their prey. Finally, Noah manages to send off everyone but Ham, the black sheep of the family. But Ham, in an echo of the predators at the beginning, claims to have turned over a new leaf. Celebrating the start of their new lives with some food and many glasses of wine, Ham asks his father about his future plans, and Noah says he'd like to work as a shamus in a synagogue, which prompts Ham to articulate his vision for his post-flood business venture. Von sich allein darf man werden a Ballerboss. Ot werden Ballerboss von der Teve. Es ist doch nicht etwas stammer soja Kasten, no, die Teve, neues Teve. A Welt ist untergegangen mit Menschen und Chayas, no, die Teve ist geblieben. Sie ist die einzige Sache, was ist geblieben von der alten Welt. Der einzige Sicher. Man darf von ihr machen ein Museum. Dem größten Saal von der zweiten Seite Teve wollen wir verdingen nach Chassanes. Und damit, wenn es wird nicht sein kein Chassanes, wollen wir dem Saal verdingen auf der Tanzofend. Von der linken Seite wollen wir haben dem Museum. Dem Museum mit allen heiligen Sachen zum Sicher von der untergegangenen Welt. Von der zweiten Seite, von der rechten, dem Saal zum Tanz mit den Zimmerlich unten. Wird er sein ernst, auf Weinton, bitte links. Tome verkehrt, ihr wilt Hanoi haben, sich verweilen, bitte rechts. Turning directly to the audience, once Noah nods off from too much wine, Ham proceeds to describe in graphic detail the photographs that will hang on the walls of the museum, capturing the carnage and misery of the flood. I'm not going to quote that here since I think we've been inundated with photos and descriptions of violence for quite a while now, and that drives home, I think, just how provocative it was for Aschendorf to conceive of this idea in the late 1940s. Ham then juxtaposes that description with his idea for the bar, something that would not be like all mod cons, as the Brits would say, not out of place in the most chic neighborhoods of New York, London, or LA. What I find most astonishing about Noch and Mabel is that by 1948, when it was first published, Aschendorf foresaw not just ways of memorializing the Holocaust, but also the exploitation of those memories, or the potential exploitation for financial or other gain. This same writer, who could so tenderly dissect the nuances of domestic situations like interfaith marriages in the immediate post-war moment, which he does in Blois Ash, Only Ashes, or families navigating their complicated relationships with one another while trying simply to survive, could be astonishingly acerbic in envisioning other facets of Holocaust memory. A few words in conclusion. I hope this presentation contributes to an appreciation of the rich landscape of this body of material. And of course, it's just a taste of the dozens of Yiddish plays, most never staged, and almost none known today, even to specialists, that grapple with the Shoah and its aftermath. This material has been all but left out of a scholarly and artistic conversation about the theater of the Holocaust that has been underway for decades. How will that conversation be altered by giving these plays their proper place in it? And how will our understanding of these plays be colored by our examining them in the context of that conversation? Similarly, Yiddish Holocaust plays have been almost completely overlooked by Yiddish scholars writing about and translating Yiddish literature produced after World War II, in many cases by the same writers contributing to the dramatic repertoire during this period. That is beginning to change, and even I'll be participating in a conference virtually, but based in Israel next month, and there is new scholarship emerging on some of these works, which is very heartening. In terms of being overlooked, sometimes I think that might be because the quantity or quality of these writers' work in other genres, such as Molodowski's in poetry. Chava Rosenfarb wrote one play, Der Vogel von Ghetto, Das Vogel von Ghetto, that's the thing gets overshadowed by her significant output in fiction, and there are other examples that they may overshadow the drama that they produced. But that can't be said, for example, of Leivik, who shuttled back and forth between poetry and drama and also produced important reportage. Or Aschendorf, who also wrote significantly in multiple genres and produced a modest but noteworthy body of post-Holocaust plays. Or Slovis, who was primarily a playwright and secondarily an essayist and travel writer. And regardless of who produced what sort of literature, these dramas are important to reckon with in order for us to fully appreciate how Jewish writers and theater artists made use of theater and drama to understand and reflect on the Holocaust, its aftermath, and significance. Finally, I'd like to be bold and make a much larger claim for this material. Not only the body of work I'm discussing in this presentation, but much of the subject matter being discussed at this conference. We need to know these plays. We need to know the material that we're all working on and just sharing here, because there are so many untold, underappreciated, overlooked, suppressed, misunderstood, absent stories of Jewish history, life, and culture, without which we can't fully understand the story of the Jews ourselves, our present, or our future. And we're, of course, in a very consequential and uncertain and anxiety-provoking moment, and the deeper we can understand where we come from, I think the better, stronger perspective we have on where we're going. So, thank you.
Thank you, Joel. This was really fascinating and also important, I think, for me. So I have two questions, but I think they're related. The first has to do with, I think, one of your final comments that much of this material was overshadowed by other sorts of creation. So maybe I'm curious to know what your impression is about these creators. Why are they drawn to the dramatic form? Because many of them are poets or authors. So what is it in the dramatic form that they find so appropriate for these subjects? And the other maybe relates more to your role as translator, about the language. And what did you find in the language of these plays as a sort of post-Holocaust Yiddish, and the texture of the language, and also the various components, like the German or the Leuchten Kodesh, or
Yeah, great questions. Your first question, Ruthie, is one of my big questions. I just find that endlessly fascinating. Particularly, I mean, it's one thing. If you're Leivik and you've been well established as a playwright for a long time, and you've got those kinds of connections, and you can send your play off to the Volksbühne or whatever. If you're Slovis, different situation, but he also has a theater background, and he can sort of help rebuild things in Paris and then connect with companies, Bucharest or Tel Aviv or wherever it might be. It's another thing for someone like Molodowski, who was not writing plays before, or some of the, there are figures who weren't professional at all. There was a now his name is escaping me for the moment, but there was a gentleman who was a pharmacist in Chicago. That was his day job, and okay, he would write something after the Shoah, but to write plays of all things, right? Like that, something that sort of by its nature you think most of the time, a playwright wants to get something up on its feet. You could so much more easily, sit at your desk when you get home from the pharmacy and write some poems, or maybe send a story off to the Forwits or something like that. There's something about theater that is drawing these people, and I think in some cases, you hear writers just say, the voices spoke to me and the characters emerged, and I think of like August Wilson's line that like when he was first writing the first play in his Pittsburgh cycle. I mean, he was already a playwright, but he said that once the characters started talking, I couldn't shut them up. And the play, it's one of these writers that the play kind of wrote itself, right? And so you have those kinds of figures, whatever mode they're writing in. Were some of these people, even if there weren't so many theaters and audiences to write for anymore, were they dreaming about a theater down the road that might do it? Maybe they're writing in Yiddish with a thought that either I or someone else might translate this into, English or Spanish or German or Hebrew, whatever it might be. Maybe there's some of that. But, I think it will vary a great deal. In terms of the language, also, and I think this sample suggests, the stylistic differences are vast. People with figures like Molodowsky and Leivik, even though Molodowsky is not a seasoned playwright, and her play, if it had time to sort of develop in the way that that a professional playwright would, and sort of, I think it would be trimmed here and there, but it's also, I think, an extraordinary work of literature, and you're in the presence of a poet. There's just, she has a way of drawing you into the characters, in my view. Leivik is so interested in language on a microscopic level, and I highly recommend his memoir, Mit der Schere zur Pleite, where he actually reflects on language from the very first pages of the book. He talks about that kind of strange phrase, the Schere zur Pleite, the saving remnant, and what does that mean? He reflects on all kinds of sort of specific words, and when he goes off and meets the DPs, some of his first observations are about the kind of lingo that they've developed, the shorthand, that they'll talk about, rather than Eretz Yisrael, they'll just say Eretz, for example. It's just like there's been this language, so he's always listening with that poet's ear, which also makes him just such a great reporter when he's writing that text.
Take another question.
Thank you so much for this really excellent paper and presentation. Like Ruthie, I was especially impressed by all of the translation, and then you're having to return to the text and go back through it to mine them for these instances that you could then share with us. So thank you for all of this. My question pertains to trying to put something like a repertory play in conversation with music, or the sphere of music. Your presentation made me reflect a lot on Amy Wolodarski's book on musical witness and Holocaust representation. And my question for you was whether you felt like, as in her book, that the positionality of these particular playwrights to the Holocaust had some special bearing on the plays that are then produced, because this is sort of the theme that she explores in this text, that she's looking at musical composers who are one or two steps removed from the Holocaust, who were not themselves in the camps, but then go on to compose. And so in a similar vein, these playwrights seem to be one or two steps potentially removed, but still, again, feel these deep reflections and have these dialogues that play out then in the body of these plays. And so that was my question for you. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And the levels of being removed or not are interesting, and we can go. There are people who survive ghettos and camps. So there's a fascinating figure, Zami Feder, who is active in the Bergen-Belsen. He had survived Bergen-Belsen and is active in the theater company, one of the leaders of the theater company that writes material for that company, directs material for it. Leivik is incredibly conscious or self-conscious about not being there. And we see that that's there in famous poems of his, like das Lied von der Gelbe Latte, the Song of the Yellow Patch, where he imagines himself there as a kind of survivor's guilt, basically. Like, here I am with my family in New York, and loved ones and other Jews in Europe are in peril and being killed. And in fact, his first volume of poetry published sort of at the very end of the war. I mean, he's already been publishing sort of Holocaust-related poetry during the war, but he publishes a volume, In Treblinka bin ich nicht gewesen. So the very title is, I was not in Treblinka. And when he goes to the DP camps, the editor of one of the DP camp newspapers sort of refers to that line and says, yes, Leivik, it's true, Leivik wasn't here with us in the camps, but basically, in sort of contemporary parlance, he has a bit of street cred because, he fled prison in Siberia. He's been writing about this so long, he lost family. So he does have that sort of credibility.
Interesting dimension.
Yeah, and also I'm kind of coming back to just sort of from another angle, but also connects back to Ruthie's first question about the choice of writing plays. I'm really interested in a bigger question of, I mean, for me, it's particularly what did Yiddish sort of theater and drama mean to people, whether it's the creators or audiences or whoever it might be, after the Shoah, but also more broadly. I mean, you can't divorce that from the question of what did any aspect of Jewish culture mean. And if you had if you have a concert singer like Emma Shaver going into the camps, who's singing Yiddish and Hebrew songs, and one of the observations that Leivik makes in one of the camps early on is that, or I think in multiple camps, he said that when you went to these gatherings of DPs, something that would happen in Leivik's view spontaneously, it seemed, was that the DPs would kind of, at the end of any gathering, they would break into two songs, Hatikva and Zognit Kemo, and so these sort of pillars of post-Shoah, memory and assertion of, Milzain and Dol and all of those sorts of things. So all of that is kind of closely wrapped up together. But I think, I appreciate part of your point of just that putting that kind of scholarship and those cultural examples in conversations with one another is really important.
And one more question.
Is there any music in the plays? I can't help asking, right?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I mean, there isn't any. There is some, and of course, I mean, they're all kind of, sort of musical reviews and things like that of the plays that are being, of course, there's all kinds of musical performance happening in various sites, during and after the Shoah, and in the same places where people like Zami Feta are writing, they're putting together musical reviews and things. To me, that's sort of part of just my sort of selecting of material. I'm, for this project, looking at sort of new drama that's written after war, and so I'm not seeing a lot of examples of that being sort of musical. But yeah.
Music as a way of drawing you in.
Right.
An example of that is The Passenger, Vyacheslav Weinberg's opera.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which the Passenger, Vyacheslav Weinberg, and we could bring it back to Yiddish theater.
Yeah.
Weinberg's father was an important conductor in Warsaw in Yiddish theater, and Weinberg grew up at the base of the podium, at his father's knee, and started conducting as a kid. Then fled to the Soviet Union just as the war was beginning, and ended up being an intimate of Shostakovich, and his entire career was in the Soviet Union, in Russian, where he became Moisei Weinberg. But he wrote this opera, and it's about space. It takes place on an ocean cruise, on a liner, where an Auschwitz guard encounters a former prisoner. And it was written by a Holocaust survivor, a Polish woman, and then converted into a Russian libretto by Alexander Medvedev, I think. But Weinberg wrote this opera, and it's recently now been staged a couple of times. But it addresses opera and Yiddish theater roots and the Holocaust and space.
Okay, thank you.
Hashtags that we all love.
So thanks, Joel. This is really opening us up to so many very fascinating things. So my question is, you mentioned the Akedah as a recurring theme. So I have two questions about that. Number one, I know in and around the same time, it's also a theme in Israeli art in many ways for obviously much of the same reasons. So what I'm curious is, I don't know if you're aware of how it plays out in Israeli literature, Israeli art, but is there a similarity to the Yiddish versus like the Israeli or Hebrew accounts of the Akedah? And is the Akedah a theme prior to the Holocaust in any substantial way?
Yeah, I have to look into more of the Israeli. I mean, the Akedah certainly comes up before, but I think becomes more of a preoccupation after. And in the Levick volume that I made, the poems that I mentioned, it comes up over and over again. And I mean, he's also there's so many sort of great themes and texts that Levick is reflecting on. And of course, I mean, I don't think that I necessarily spelled that out in talking about the Chassan and Fellenwald, but naming the child Yitzchak and the parents Avram and Sarah, it's certainly there, and it also comes up explicitly in that play too. They talk about that text itself. They don't just sort of allude to it. But that's something I'll have to look into more as sort of how that's coming up in Israeli, art and literature. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel, for really fascinating and moving presentation. This question might sound a bit tangential or off the wall even, but one thing that struck me, I can't recall right now which of the images it was, but one of the scripts had a very modern typeface, and I've noticed that in several Yiddish, in fiction and theater plays, that the typefaces and the kind of arrangement of the letters on the page can be really strikingly modern. And I wondered who's doing that design work, and what's the context for that, and is this a kind of continuation of interwar Yiddish modernism, or what's going on in there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly, I mean, that's a great observation. And I mean, there is a rich tradition there of Yiddish printmaking and poster making and book making and things like that. And I'm trying to think of that there's a huge book in French that the title is escaping me now, of lots and lots of that material. Certainly, like David Mazauer at the Book Center is very interested and knowledgeable about that sort of thing. And I mean, Eddie Portnoy at Evo also has done a lot of interesting things with that material. So there's it's a fascinating tradition, and of course drawing upon broader sort of Central and Eastern European traditions of those sorts of things in Germany and Poland and Russia and things like that. Yeah.